By the time federal investigators pieced it together, the damage was already irreversible. Evidence rooms were compromised. Inmates were running outside drug operations from inside their cells. Guards were no longer enforcing rules but negotiating with detainees. And dozens of people who had never been convicted of a crime had already passed through a system that could permanently scar them. What happened inside this jail didn't unfold in a single riot or headline-grabbing collapse. It happened quietly, over years, until the institution itself no longer functioned. That institution was the Baltimore City Detention Center, a sprawling pretrial jail complex in downtown Baltimore, Maryland. For decades, it processed thousands of detainees each year. Most were awaiting trial. Many would never be convicted. But by the late 2000s and early 2010s, the jail had earned a reputation not just for overcrowding or neglect, but for something far worse: total loss of control. What made Baltimore City Detention Center uniquely dangerous was not just violence, but inversion of authority. The people locked inside increasingly dictated how the jail operated. And the people paid to enforce order were, in many cases, helping them do it. At first glance, the jail looked like many aging urban detention centers in the United States. Large, understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed by a steady flow of detainees from city courts. But inside, daily life followed rules that were unofficial, unrecorded, and often enforced by gangs rather than officers. Housing units were controlled by inmate groups who decided who could move, who could sleep, and who would be targeted next. Contraband flowed through the facility with astonishing ease. Drugs, cell phones, cigarettes, cash. None of it moved by accident. Investigations later showed that correctional officers were central to the operation. Some smuggled items in exchange for money. Others did it out of fear. A few did it because the system had already collapsed around them. And that raised a question no one could easily answer at the time. If guards were participating, who was actually in charge? The answer depended on where you stood. In certain units, gangs effectively ran internal economies. They controlled access to phones. They arranged assaults. They coordinated drug distribution that extended beyond the jail walls. Law enforcement later confirmed that some inmates were directing street-level criminal activity from inside, using smuggled phones to communicate freely with associates outside. But that wasn't the worst part. Baltimore City Detention Center held primarily pretrial detainees. People legally presumed innocent. They were not serving sentences. They were waiting. Waiting for hearings. Waiting for bail. Waiting for trials that could take months or years. And during that waiting period, they were exposed to an environment where protection was not guaranteed by the state, but negotiated through submission or affiliation. Those without gang ties were particularly vulnerable. Reports documented frequent assaults, intimidation, and extortion. Lockdowns were common, sometimes lasting days. Medical care was inconsistent. Complaints often went unanswered. And when violence occurred, it was not always investigated. In this environment, silence became a survival strategy. Oversight mechanisms existed on paper. The facility was under the authority of the state of Maryland, not the city. There were inspections. There were reports. There were audits. But none of them stopped the deeper erosion taking place inside. Each year, staff shortages grew worse. Turnover increased. Experienced officers left. New hires received limited training and were placed into volatile units with little support. And then the scandals began to surface. Federal prosecutors uncovered cases where guards had entered into sexual relationships with inmates. In some instances, those relationships involved coercion. In others, they involved payment. Either way, they shattered any remaining boundary between authority and detainee. Guards smuggled drugs and phones. Inmates paid them with money, protection, or influence. One case stood out because of how openly it exposed the rot. Members of a gang inside the jail were found to be running an extensive drug operation, coordinating deliveries, managing finances, and enforcing discipline, all from within the detention center. Correctional officers were not just looking the other way. Some were actively facilitating it. That revelation forced a hard question into the open. If criminal enterprises could operate uninterrupted inside a secure detention facility, what else was happening that no one could see? The answer was grim. Violence inside the jail was not always explosive. Much of it was routine. Threats, beatings, sexual abuse. Inmates learned quickly which areas were unsafe and which guards could be approached for favors or protection. Those who reported abuse risked retaliation. Those who didn't often carried the consequences alone. Medical neglect compounded the danger. Detainees with mental illness were particularly at risk. Isolation was sometimes used as a control measure, not a treatment. Suicide attempts and self-harm incidents occurred in an environment already stretched beyond its capacity to respond. But the most disturbing aspect was how normalized it all became. Staff adapted to dysfunction. Inmates adapted to danger. Administrators managed crises instead of preventing them. Each layer of the system adjusted downward, redefining what was acceptable until the unacceptable became routine. Few people outside ever learned what happened next. As investigations widened, they revealed not just individual misconduct, but institutional failure. Supervisors ignored warning signs. Complaints disappeared. Security cameras were broken or poorly monitored. Internal discipline was inconsistent. In some cases, officers under investigation remained on duty for extended periods. The facility's physical condition mirrored its operational decay. Buildings were old. Infrastructure failed. Plumbing backed up. Cells deteriorated. Overcrowding made every problem worse. Tension had nowhere to go. Public defenders and civil rights groups raised alarms. Lawsuits were filed. Reports documented patterns of abuse and neglect. Still, the jail remained open. And that led to another contradiction. If the facility was known to be dangerous, why did it continue to operate? The answer lay in logistics and inertia. Closing a major urban detention center is not simple. Courts rely on it. Police rely on it. The system absorbs dysfunction until it can no longer pretend to function at all. That breaking point came in the mid-2010s. Mounting evidence, combined with federal scrutiny and public pressure, made the status quo impossible to defend. The state announced plans to close the Baltimore City Detention Center. Detainees would be relocated. Operations would wind down. The complex would eventually be shuttered. For many, the announcement felt overdue. But closure did not erase what had already happened. Thousands of people had passed through a facility where safety was uncertain and authority compromised. Some left with trauma. Some with addictions worsened by access to drugs inside. Some with criminal connections formed not on the street, but behind bars. And for staff, the legacy was equally damaging. Officers who tried to do their jobs were placed in impossible positions. Others faced prosecution. Trust between employees and administration collapsed. Careers ended under investigation. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. The detention center officially closed in 2015. The buildings remain, silent reminders of a system that failed from the inside out. What replaced it was not a single solution, but a set of reforms meant to prevent similar collapses elsewhere. Increased oversight. Better training. Reduced reliance on large pretrial jails. At least on paper. But the lessons of Baltimore City Detention Center extend beyond one facility. They expose the risks of prolonged pretrial detention, the consequences of understaffing, the dangers of allowing corruption to go unchallenged, and the human cost of assuming that dysfunction is manageable until it isn't. Most of all, they challenge a common assumption. That danger inside a jail is inevitable. That violence is simply part of incarceration. The reality is more uncomfortable. The danger grew where accountability disappeared, where oversight failed, where authority was traded away piece by piece. The jail did not become feared overnight. It became feared because warning signs were ignored, and because those inside had no meaningful way to force change. When the doors finally closed, there was no dramatic ending. No final confrontation. Just the quiet end of an institution that had already collapsed long before its last detainee left. And that may be the most unsettling part. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.